Hello and welcome to another episode of Statford Bridge, Chelsea by the Numbers. This is my fourth attempt at trying to record this, because every time something happens. So, hopefully, you're hearing this. Chelsea lost 3-1 to Manchester City in what was a deeply frustrating game for a few reasons. Even if you think this team is good, which I do, I am one of the people who think this team is pretty good. And if you think Maresca is solid and you think the players are good, all of these things, the team is still without a touchstone or a keystone or a marquee signature performance and win. There are games that Chelsea have won, mostly against weaker teams. I think the two best teams Chelsea have beaten this year are Bournemouth and Newcastle. Nobody ahead of them in the table. I guess Newcastle are ahead of them in the table right now. But they didn't play that well in either of those games. And there are games where Chelsea have played very well and not won them. Like, I thought Chelsea were quite decent against Arsenal. I thought they were okay the first City game. I thought they were okay the Liverpool game, but not great. And they've had quite good games against teams beneath them, like Palace and Forest, and not won them. But they don't have that, like, one where they put it all together and everybody's like, I see it. I see it. And the players can look at it and be like, I see it. And I think a lot of people, including myself, thought, given where City are, there's a real chance that this game is the one. Like, this is the game where that happens. And it just wasn't that. Chelsea put up one of their worst performances of the season. You look at the expected goal difference and you're like, okay, you play City away, you lose by half an expected goal, 2/3 of an expected goal. That's fine. But when you kind of put the context to this of 0.3 of this comes from a Nico Jackson chance that is obviously offside but was not flagged. So it's 1.5. 0.9 comes from an empty goal off of a crazy turnover the first minute of the game. So in the remaining 89 minutes, which Chelsea were losing for 30 of, they generated a whopping 0.5 XG. Not good. 10 shots is their lowest total of the year. They've done it one other time. They had 22 box touches. That's one in their bottom 3 for box touches all year. They give up 7 big chances, which is gargantuan number of big chances. They give up a pretty huge XG total. I think if I go for the whole season in terms of XGA, it's their second highest XGA of the year behind Spurs, where they were also brutal, especially in the first half. So you end up in this situation where it's like it's just not a good performance. And when you look at it and say, okay, it's not a good performance and you lose, there's two lanes you can really pick. Right? You could say this is a ball doesn't go in game, or the opponent's ball goes in. This is not that game. You could say the players are not good enough. And I think that's like a particularly intoxicating argument for a game like this, where you look at Bob Sanchez make a critical error to go down 2-1 in a period where Chelsea were playing mostly quite well. And you look at Jackson missing the chance to go up 2-0, and Maresca said post-match, if we score the second goal to go up 2-0 on the transition where Palmer plays a square, he overhits it. After watching it, I think Jackson probably should just try and finish it first time. He doesn't. He lays it off for Sancho, who gets blocked. I got hammered for tweeting that I think after watching it, he should shoot first time. And half of the people say, how could you ever not think that? And the other half of the people are like, you're an idiot. It was an overhit pass. And I think it was both an overhit pass and he should have swung at it. So it is what it is. Nani Madueke has a critical error on the first goal where his line is 5 yards deeper than everybody else, and it plays Mateus Nunes onside. I think it's intoxicating to make that argument. We're going to talk about Sanchez specifically, but I think the other argument in that Maresca made pretty poor tactical choices is the objectively correct one in this scenario. And we'll get to the board, but we're going to talk about Sanchez first. On shot stopping, the shot stopping metrics, Sanchez looks like he had a fine game. Minus 0.7 on 2.4 XG on target is like whatever. It's kind of run of the mill. But To me, it's the decisions he made have just become the decisions he's made have become such a problem in the same way over and over again that you're probably just better off moving on. I've said a lot this year that I think Sanchez is probably average. I stand by that. I think he is probably average. And I think the thing that I'm kind of getting to is that like his particular brand of average is damaging to a young, high variance team, which is what Chelsea are, right? There's pretty big swings up and down in performance. They're very young. They make mistakes. They need a steady hand behind them, and certainly not one who introduces his own errors to the equation. And I think Sanchez is a fine shot stopper. I think the bigger problem is much more the decision making things. So, like for example, if we look at the first two goals, the first goal, Gundogan plays a chipped ball over the top for Mateus Nunes. Whatever about Nani messing up the offside line, these things happen. Sanchez correctly recognizes the ball is going to Nunes. I can't come and sweep this. However, he decides to drop into his goal very early. Again, no problems with that. But Nunez's touch is really bad. And as he takes the touch, Sanchez is still backing up. At some point, he takes 6 steps. He takes 4 steps and a crossover. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then he decides, actually, I need to come forward for the ball. And now he comes, he contests the 1v1, he makes the 1v1 save, but he's so late to decide that he's contesting the 1v1 that he can't sweep this and claim it, because this ball rolls all the way into the penalty area before Nunes makes contact. If he's more proactive with his starting position, or he correctly recognizes the weight on the pass earlier, he just scoops this ball up, or he clears it with his feet, and the danger is averted. But he decides too late he has to come, and now you have a 1v1 that it just hits you, it bounces off Cucurella on the ground, Gvardiol gets a tap in into an empty goal. I think this one is maybe a little bit harsh to go way over the top on, but I do think when you end up in these like, will they, won't they, herky-jerky back and forth, it leaves you very open to bad things happening to you, where I almost would have preferred he either stay high, read the touch, see what happens, and like if you see this touch and you're like, okay, it's definitely not going to run to me, you can drop to your 6 and deal with the save, especially with Cucurella contesting. Or you can drop early and just stay home and deal with the shot, because the shot wasn't good. If he stays home on the 6, he just saves the 1v1 and he holds it and the danger is over, right? Look how late he decides to come forward. So he's decided to go backwards. The ball is going to go all the way to here, and then he's going to decide, actually, I need to come forward now, which to me is just like an objectively bad decision. It's just too late. It's just too late. If we look at the second goal, look where the ball is. It is going away from goal. He has no chance of beating Erling Haaland in a full sprint to this ball. Not even a little bit of a chance. And I do think that this moment is like somewhat probably impacted by the first half where he gets done by not coming early enough. He has no chance of getting to this ball. That he has even considered coming is insane. And he starts coming, and now he's like, oh, actually, I can't get there. So he decides, okay, I'm gonna go home. Which, to me, sometimes you get the first call wrong. No problem. You can save this situation by you take 2 steps. You're like, I'm not going to get there. You drop into your goal. You stay home. If you think about the chance Erling Haaland gets in the 53rd, 54th minute, it's very similar. It's a ball over the top. Almost the exact same situation, but it's Colwill instead of Chalobah. Sanchez makes the same movement and then goes, I'm not getting there, drops into his goal. Haaland squares up Colwill, takes a great shot. Sanchez makes a good save. And the situation is averted. Instead of going all the way home, Sanchez like sets on the edge of his box. He just squares up and is like, all right, I'm here. I'm making this my last stand. I have no idea why. Totally loses himself in the goal. Haaland shifts past Trev and chips Sanchez into an empty goal. And it is genuinely some of the most perplexing goalkeeping I have ever seen in my life. It makes not even a little bit of sense. It makes not even a little bit of sense. And when you couple those sorts of things with the tactical things that you're about to talk about, you can't win games against good teams. And so I think for Chelsea, you are probably at this point better off just playing Jorgensen. Let him be a steadier hand, which is unbelievable that the 22-year-old is a steadier hand than the 27-year-old experienced goalkeeper, but that's where we are. So that's the player stuff. I don't have very much to say about the other players who I all thought did not play well, but I don't think anyone was specifically worth criticizing other than Bob Sanchez. But I do think you should look at the big picture of the performance in the context of the season, in that Chelsea were very, very ineffective in possession. Their number of build-up attacks and transitions that they generated was very low. Their number of high presses were very low. They were very much unable to win second balls. They got into the box at a much lower rate than they normally do. It was a very, very weak performance. And I think there's two things to talk about. So first, we have seen Chelsea build in a number of different shapes and forms this year. Almost always 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 2 double sixes, sometimes a diamond, whatever you want. Sometimes a Sanchez becoming a center back. We've seen lots of that. And the way Chelsea built this game, the most obvious way to build felt like James at right center back, Chalobah middle center back, Colwill to the left, with Cucurella coming into midfield. And I think against like very good pressing teams, that orientation makes sense, in that Reece James is a very, very good passer, but he's not great at turning. And when you're playing teams who are going to press aggressively, that skill set, unless you're really, really good, like you are Romeo Lavia level, evade pressure and turn, it's not useful in that situation. So when we have Cucurella go inside into midfield, for example, a lot of his role is just to like get marked and give his space to other people. So using James in that way, I think, is a mistake. And what we saw was the back three was very much Chalobah, Colwill, Cucurella. James goes into midfield. City defended, I think, quite interestingly. They very, very deliberately tried to deny Levi Colwill the ball in the build. It was a very deliberate decision. They set up essentially from a 4-3-3 with Kovacic as the 6, Bernardo Silva and Gundogan ahead of them. And then they went almost player to player, where Kovacic marked Palmer, the fullback stayed with the wingers, one of the center backs picked up Jackson, one of the center backs was free. You have Holland and one of the 8s deal with Colwill and Chalobah, and you leave Cucurella as the free man, who did not build deeper. He started to build in more traditional fullback spots. And the tough thing for Chelsea is that they had Silva or Holland start high to deny Colwill very often, which meant you got lots of Sanchez skips to Cucurella, or you got them to go into Chalobah and then around into Cucurella. And because James is narrow, it's very difficult for you to play Chalobah on the first one and then go into Palmer without Palmer coming really wide and really low, which then you have to play 3v4 on the last line, and is very difficult because James is not getting here, right? He's not getting on the last line. We saw that a lot. Or you end up in a situation where like Madueke has to come low, and those situations just aren't great when you're facing your own goal. And so I think that was a big shortcoming in the build, was they denied Colwill, and then they played man-to-man. What I think City did particularly well was they were not so wedded to their player-to-player principles that if Chelsea had rotations, they would just follow. So, for example, we saw a couple times that James did come high and Palmer would come low, and Omar Marmoush would just go wide. And all of a sudden, this rotation is not dangerous anymore. And Kovacic would stay home. We also saw a couple times where James would come even narrower, and Madueke would come low, and they would do the change how they wanted. They would pass players on eventually. Perhaps the most obvious example of this was when Sanchez did hit the skip to Cucurella. You would think that maybe the fullback would jump, or you would expect Bernardo Silva to get here. But what we saw a lot was actually Foden would come, and then it's not man marking, right? If this was Chelsea, it would look like this. Wesley Fofana would be all the way with the 8, and then you end up with all these scary things to get this player into depth. But what City did was they would have this player come from straight inside to try and deny the ability to play Enzo Fernandez, and this player's busting his ass to get here. And if you want to go back around to Colwill, who's now just going to get pressed inside and have to go back to Sanchez, and now we're back into the exact same scenario we were a minute ago, it doesn't work because they did the handoffs really, really, really well. And that's not to say Chelsea didn't ever play through, but I think what happened was a lot of the time, City would really initiate the press and say, okay, Mr. Sanchez, you're going to break a line on the ground with pressure. They couldn't do it. I think if you had Chelsea build something like this, where you have James and Colwill as actual fullbacks, and you have the two strikers going to Sanchez and Chalobah, well, now this is very difficult for them to deal, right? Where if you have Cucurella into the space and you build 4-2 with Sanchez, if he curls very aggressively, Sanchez can just go into the last line and you're great. If he goes straight out, you play to Colwill, who can drive into the next line and has options to break the line. And we didn't see them build the Sanchez as one of the center backs even one time the whole game. I think Sanchez was a little bit eager to kick long in this game, but it didn't work in possession. I thought it was a very, very poor game from them in the way they built. And whatever, you can do this the other way if you want to do Chalobah at right back and have Colwill and Sanchez be it. You bring Cucurella low and you can bring James high or whatever you want. Absolutely, but that was firmly not what Chelsea got to. On the other side of the ball, I think, is the more impactful choices. I think Chelsea built very poorly, and those things hurt the game. But on the flip side of it, and I realize this is a very tactics sport heavy section, so I would really recommend you watch this on YouTube where you can see the players moving. But on the other side of things, Chelsea had a very, very interesting game plan, and there were things that I liked and things that I didn't like. Chelsea started the game 4-1-4-1. It will look a lot like 4-4-2 for much of the game, but it was very much a 4-1-4-1, which we have seen Chelsea do in the last couple of games more frequently. They made a very concerted effort that as soon as the ball went to Kusanov, they would snap in to almost player for player. So as soon as the ball went to Kusanov as the right center back who was making his Manchester City debut, Jackson would sprint straight out. Palmer would jump to the 6 and almost the center back. Caicedo would come. Enzo Fernandez would come mark the strong side 6. Sancho would jump to the fullback. Cucurella would jump to the winger. Madueke would come narrow. And Caicedo is free floating to mop up everything, while Colwill and Chalobah deal with Marmoush and Holland. And this worked really well. The first turnover of the game is basically a big kick long that they get to counterpress Kusanov on. Right after that, Kusanov receives the ball. Jackson presses him. Palmer makes this jump to the 6, wins the ball. Kusanov immediately gets booked. The big Palmer transition chance is a little bit higher up the pitch, but it is almost the exact same situation. Palmer applies pressure from the 6 to the center back with Jackson coming inside. They play a pass into somebody's feet, jammed, and Chalobah just smashes him and they get a transition. It was a very clear 4-1-4-1, jumps to 4-4-2, and you lock on. After 10 minutes, if we go back to the base 4-1-4-1 shape that Chelsea had, City made a couple changes. First, they get both fullbacks really, really, really high. Nunez and Guardiola get super, super high. Now, we see this with Chelsea all the time, that you load the last line with players and you're able to go +1. Chelsea's counter principle, right? We talk about principles and counter principles, is that the wingers follow. Well, what happens now is because Sancho follows, or because Madueke follows the fullbacks all the way low, you end up in a situation where it's like James has to go into midfield or Cucurella has to go into midfield, and you end up like this, where your fullbacks are there, your center backs are on an island, and your wingers are just man marking people. And now all of a sudden, if you split your center backs and you drop a 6 between them, it is now very unclear who goes where, because, well, Jackson and Palmer are like, well, we want to take these guys. And Enzo and Caicedo are like, well, we're going to man mark the double sixes. And it's like, does this work? And the answer is obviously not. So what happened a lot of the time is you would see that Bernardo Silva and Kovacic would come deep to collect the ball. Jackson and Palmer would be very unsure of who is supposed to step to the ball, or they'd be tired from chasing. And you have Enzo Fernandez and Caicedo who don't want to follow the 6 past Palmer and Jackson because that's stupid. And because Chelsea have really poor handoff principles, they don't have the ability to flex between zonal principles and man-to-man principles. Right? John McKenzie calls this hybrid pressing. Because they don't have that ability, you end up with all these scenarios where, like, Jackson's out here and Enzo's up here and Caicedo gets pulled out wide. And it's just like a black hole in the middle of the pitch with no pressure on the ball and space in behind. And that's exactly how Chelsea get done. It's exactly how Chelsea get done. And what happened a lot of the time, because they were so uncomfortable with this, is that they would drop their lines really deep. Not really deep, but they would drop their lines very deep. And you would have Sancho try and pick up in here, and you'd maybe have Madueke come in, and they try and get dense, but now you have all these players here that nobody wants to follow, but people aren't picking up between the lines either, and you don't have enough pressure on the ball, and all of a sudden it's very easy to play Marmoush in depth, or Holland in depth, or Guardiola or Nunez in depth. And listen, my objections are not to the high line. I think playing an aggressive line against City is neither here nor there. The problem is that there was not adequate pressure on the ball. And so if you look at Chelsea's PPDA in 15-minute segments, right? So if I zoom in on this so you can see it a little bit clearer. If you look at Chelsea's PPDA in 15-minute segments, and you look at their expected goal difference and their shot difference in those 15-minute segments, pressing generally is like 10 to 15. But you can certainly say a PPDA of 50 is very much not pressing. And so if you look by 15-minute segments, I would call Chelsea's press in the first 15 minutes of the game significantly more aggressive than other portions of the game. Massive expected goal difference, positive shot difference. Minutes 15 to 30 is kind of holding pattern. City started to figure things out. If you look at the expected threat maps, it's kind of the same trend. Chelsea maintain a positive expected goal difference, -1 on the shot difference. The last 15 minutes of the half, Chelsea stop pressing entirely. They just drop into a mid-block, no pressure on the ball. The line is high. They get absolutely wrecked for 15 minutes. -6 shot difference, -1.5 expected goal difference. They concede a goal. The second half starts. I thought Chelsea made a good call to bring the press back to start the second half. It was much more aggressive with Nico Jackson on the pitch. They were really, really denying City's ability to get anything going. 0 expected goal difference, +3 shot difference. Chelsea take 4 shots, City take 1. It's okay. Jackson goes off at the 60th minute. Press dies. They drop back into the mid-block. They concede, -2 shot difference. You're chasing the game late. You concede another one, whatever. But to me, and it's tough to use, like, this is small sample size stuff, but to me, you look at these two periods of the game and you're like, okay, Chelsea, like, actually They actually pressed a little bit. Not even that well. They pressed a little bit, and City couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle it. They did not manage it well. But when Chelsea dropped off and let them do their thing and rotate the guys around, and like we saw Chelsea have so much problem, even if it wasn't the sixes splitting, if it was like out here, and Enzo's like, well, do I follow him all the way out here? I don't know. Didn't work. And when we talk about the coaching stuff, one of my red flags before the season was Maresca was going to be two-man marquee and he wasn't going to make enough subs. And for 17 games, Chelsea weren't very man marquee and he made plenty of subs. And then you look at the last 6 games and he stopped making substitutions and he went Superman marquee. And all of a sudden, Chelsea stop winning games and start playing poorly, and they have their worst expected goal difference streak of the year. So that to me is very frustrating. At the big picture, Chelsea's metrics are still mostly fine. I've included everything in here because I'm including it for every game, and I'm not going back and looking what is and isn't offside, so we're just going to run with it. 3/4 of a goal non-penalty expected goal difference is great. The penalties thing is still a thing. Shot difference is still +5. That's great. Box touch difference is +10. That's great. The defense is not good. 1.2 is much better than last year, but it's still not amazing. You can live with it. The attack is pretty good. All these things are true. But that's where Chelsea are. They're pretty good, but they don't have that many points on the board. So I've swapped out Spurs and United, who stink, out of it. I've added Forest and Bournemouth for popular request into the chasing pack. And if we look through, there are a couple adjustments. So if we take the projections based on how many points you have, and then if you got the exact same result as last year, this is where we are. Chelsea are still +8 on last season. They're still 7 points ahead of any of the Champions League teams if you assume that Arsenal, City, and Liverpool are the 3 above them. The likelihood that 2 of these teams come ahead of Chelsea is very low. But I wanted to see, because we're at a point now, once you hit about 30 games, 27 games, your season's metrics, like that you have that year, are much more important, or not much more important, but are more important than other metrics available to you, right? Like, we've been assuming they're going to get the exact same as last year, but at some point they're not the same as last year, right? Like, if you look at Bournemouth, for example, Bournemouth are clearly a much better team than last year. Forest have 8 more points than they do all of last year already. So if we say, yeah, Forest are only going to get to 56, are they going to take 12 points from their last 15 games? Because that's what they took in those 15 games last year? No, probably not, right? So I built an adjusted projection that is ignores the results from last year and looks at over the whole course of the season the year before, takes your points per game, and it takes your points per game of this season and then weights them based on how many games you've played. So you've played 23 games at this season's points per game, and then you get 15 games of last season's points per game. What's the average of those two? And then project that out over the last 15 games. If you do that, the race is remarkably tight, right? So you have Villa, who were better last year than they were this year, so they get shrunk a little bit. Forest are much better this year than last year, so they get a little boost from 56 to 60. Chelsea are in a little bit of a weird place where Chelsea have an almost identical points per game to last year through the first 23 games. But if we look at last year's season total, in the first 23 games from this year's calendar, Chelsea took 32 points. In the remaining 15 games, West Ham away, Brighton away, Southampton away, Leicester away, they took 31. So when we're looking at kind of the year over year and saying, well, like, yeah, Chelsea are still 8 points ahead of last year because they have 40 instead of 32. Objectively true from those same games, right? But Chelsea really backloaded a lot of their points last year. So when you do this, Chelsea get a huge hit to their points per game and come down to something like 59. Now, this is a big delta, 12-point delta between the two. And you say, okay, which one do you think you're going to get here? I think 71 is more likely than 59 considerably. But I think my vibes-based projection is probably closer to 67, 68 right now. Small improvement on last year. Mostly because I'm very frustrated with how things are right now. But we'll see how they go from there. Newcastle get a little bump because they're basically the same in terms of pace from last year. So we'll see. We'll see how these things go. Nonetheless, that's where we are. Chelsea are still a top 4 expected goal difference. They still have a reasonable schedule the rest of the way. They are very competitive on points with Newcastle and City and Forest and Bournemouth and so on, and Villa who drew today. But I think this is the real chasing pack. These kind of Forest through Bournemouth, and let's see how it goes. The other half of this that I wanted to talk about is I haven't spoken much about the women's team, who are very good this year. They signed Naomi Girma, which was announced pre-match. Naomi Girma, I spoke about on stream, is the best women's center back in the world. They broke a world record transfer fee to buy her. Center back is comfortably the weakest position in Chelsea's squad since Kadisha Buchanan has gone down with an ACL tear. They played Arsenal this morning, yesterday when this comes out for you, and won 1-0 at Stamford Bridge. That puts them 7 points clear of United, 9 points clear of City, 10 points clear of Arsenal. United are a fake team. Their expected goal difference is comfortably lower than the other 3 top teams. But Chelsea have such a gargantuan point difference. They are also unbeaten that they are 95% plus to win the league at this point. They could lose to both City and United and still would not lose. And in the FAWSL, those head-to-head games are huge deciders, and that Chelsea have only dropped 1 point or 1 match outside of that in a draw has been pretty tremendous. For them. So I would highly recommend you give this team a watch because they are very, very, very good. And they are very, very, very good without 2 of their best players really playing very much at all. Lauren James only plays 40 minutes in this game. Myra Ramirez goes at halftime. Sam Kerr hasn't played at all. So you can imagine this team coming into the back half of the season is going to add Sam Kerr at some point and is adding Naomi Girma. That's 2 legitimately world-class players. For comparison, if you don't follow the women's team that closely, that would be the equivalent of adding a 25-year-old Van Dijk and I don't know who Sam Kerr is at this point, Lewandowski or something like that. Just an insane, one of the world's best goal scorers. So, pretty good. This team's pretty good. They're very fun to watch. And I think they much more embody the spirit of Chelsea than the men's side does these days. Anyways, we're going to wrap up there. If you're liking the podcast, if you're liking the streams, subscribe, share, all those sorts of things. If there's things you want to talk about, hit me up on Blue Sky or Twitter at Keir Doyle. I jumped on Goldberg's stream after my stream the other day, and we had a pretty good chat about some of the recruitment stuff with Nini. So you might want to give that a listen as well. But that's where we're headed. We won't be streaming for West Ham. There will be a podcast afterwards. And we'll see how it goes. The live stream watch along curse continues. Chelsea lost again. But as always, friends, enjoy the soccer.